Morning, we would like to turn to the book of Luke, chapter 24. Book of Luke, chapter 24, we'll read verses 13 through verse 35. And behold, two of them went that same day to a village called Emmaus, which was from Jerusalem about 80 furlongs. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. It came to pass that while they communed together and reasoned, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were holden that they should not know him. And he said unto them, What manner of communications are these that ye have one to another as ye walk, and are sad? And one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answering said unto him, Art thou only a stranger in Jerusalem, and hast not known the things which are come to pass there in these days? And he said unto them, What things? And they said unto him concerning Jesus of Nazareth, which was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priest and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death, and have crucified him. But we trusted that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel. And beside all this, today is the third day since these things were done. Yea, and certain women also of our own company made us astonished, which were early at the sepulchre. And when they found not his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels, which said that he was alive. And certain of them which were with us went to the sepulchre, and found it even so as the women had said, but him they saw not. Then he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things, and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. And they drew nigh unto the village whither they went, and he made as though he would have gone further. But they constrained him, saying, Abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went in to tarry with them. And it came to pass, as he sat at meat with them, he took bread, and blessed it, and brake it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. And they said one to another, Did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened to us the Scriptures? And they rose up the same hour and returned to Jerusalem, and found the 11 gathered together, and them that were with him, saying, The Lord is risen indeed, and hath appeared to Simon. And they told what things were done in the way, and how he was known of them in breaking of bread. What we read here, of course, is a post-resurrection appearance of Christ, only recorded by Luke. It is the longest and certainly one of the most fascinating of post-resurrection accounts. Back in Luke chapter 23, we read that 3 days prior to our text that Jesus was crucified and buried. Coming to chapter 24 and verse 1, we see it's the first day of the week. That is Sunday. Not Monday, but Sunday. The very early in the morning. Reading on, we see that some women had gone to the tomb that morning. And the message from the angels to them was, He is not here, but is risen. We read in verse 9 of Luke 24 that they returned from the sepulchre and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest, that is, the rest that were with the 11. The result of their testimony upon the disciples of the Lord is recorded in verse 11 of Luke 24. And their words seemed to them as idle or frivolous, trivial, insignificant, and they believed them not. And then coming to our text, verse 13, we read, two of them. Two of who? Well, those who had heard the testimony of the women concerning the risen Christ and believed them not. Two of them. And we see on that same day, Sunday in this case, Resurrection Sunday, these two went into a village called Emmaus. This was about 80 furlongs, or about 7.5 miles from Jerusalem to Emmaus. In verse 16, we're told that one of these is a man by the name of Cleopas. The other person in our text may very well be the wife of Cleopas. Notice if you keep a mark there and go to John 19, verse 25. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. So it is highly probable that what we read here in verse 13 is husband and wife headed home from Emmaus to Jerusalem. But regardless, doesn't really matter. The most important thing is what happened that day on that road. What happened that day was a personal encounter with a risen Christ. What happened that day was unexpected. What happened that day was a very heart-filling experience. Now these two, Cleopas and the other, no doubt had traveled this road before, many times, yet this journey would be quite different. The end result of what happened on that road is recorded in verses 31 and 32. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him. And they said one to another, did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened to us the Scriptures? Their eyes were opened, and there was a burning in their hearts. That is, they experienced deep feelings, deep longings. There was an intense passion. There was elation. There was energy, all concerning Christ and what he had shown them. What happened this day in what we'll call the Emmaus Road was a transformation of lives. And what happened that day still happens today. And the reason is because Christ is still alive. What happened that day needs to happen today. What happened that day was a life-altering, life-changing, direction-changing event that moved these two individuals beyond where they were spiritually. And every single one of us, no matter what our level of spirituality might be, need to be moved beyond that. We need to go further than where we are. What we see here is Jesus working a spiritual resurrection in the lives of His people. Jesus bringing His people beyond where they were spiritually. We need this. We need a personal encounter with a risen Christ. Again, what happened that day led to verse 31 and verse 32. Their eyes were opened and they knew Him. And there was a burning in their hearts. And as Christ and these two are walking along, notice verse 18, the last two words, these days. They were very difficult and trying days for God's people. The subject of the message this morning is open eyes and burning hearts in trying times. First of all, we want to set the stage for this walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus. It was a very trying time. Again, verse 18, the things which are come to pass there, Jerusalem, in these days. Well, what had come to pass? Well, we see that in verse 20. And how the chief priests and our rulers delivered Him to be condemned to death and have crucified Him. Jesus Christ was so abhorred, so detested, that He was arrested, He was mocked, falsely accused, condemned to die, and crucified. As the jeering and taunting crowd looked on. And on top of this, Christ's tomb is now empty. We see that in verses 22 and 24. But again, that phrase, in these days. These were days of sin. These were days of apostasy. These were days of fierce opposition to Jesus Christ. They were days of great wickedness, days of trial, days of difficulty, days of distress, days that were exasperating to the people of God, days that were tormenting to the people of God. And as you listen to these two, as they walk along and as they speak to one another, you cannot help but hear a tone of anxiety, a tone of stress and grief in their words. So it was a very trying time. Also, the things that had come to pass in those days had had an adverse effect upon the Lord's people. So these two disciples are walking along this road, headed back to Emmaus. They're talking to one another. And what they're talking about is what they perceived had happened. It's referred to 3 times in our text that they were talking together. Notice verse 14. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. In verse 15, and it came to pass that while they communed together and reasoned, and then in verse 17, Jesus said unto them, what manner of communications are these that ye have one with another? So these two are in a conversation as they walk this road, headed back to Emmaus. The condition of these two disciples is very emblematic of the life and condition of the vast majority of those who profess salvation today. Several things about their condition. Their walk was marked by unbelief. Verse 13, notice the phrase again, and behold, two of them. They are, verse 9, a part of all the rest, and a part of those in verse 11, who thought that the testimony concerning the risen Christ was merely an idle tale. We also know that they lacked faith because of what Jesus said unto them in verse 25. Then he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. So these two were very slow. They were very hesitant. They were reluctant to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And I believe this is really the root of their condition, their hesitancy, their reluctancy to believe the Scriptures. But notice also the direction of their walk. They're going from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Now, Jerusalem to the Jew was the city of promise. It's the city of purpose. It's the city of the presence of God. And upon the report of an empty tomb, and as a result of their reluctancy to believe, they have left the 11 and the rest. They have left the 11 and the rest, and they are headed back to the routines of Emmaus. They are headed back to the ordinary life of Emmaus. They're going in the direction of the commonplace. They're going in the direction of the temporal. And today, so many of God's people are headed in the direction of the ordinary. That's where they live. So there they are, headed back home. They have left the 11, they have left the rest. What are they doing? They're withdrawing. They're withdrawing from the people of God. They are returning to Emmaus because as far as they're concerned, it's all over. It's all over. All their hopes, all their dreams have been crushed. As far as they're concerned, there's nothing to stay in Jerusalem for. So they head home. They're headed back to Emmaus, believing that there's nothing better for them than the life, the routines of Emmaus. And may I say that is never true of the child of God. There's always something better for you and I. As they walked along, they were caught up in human reasoning. Notice verse 15. They communed together and reasoned. Well, if you don't believe, that's what's left. Reason. Only a week before, their hopes had risen to a fever pitch when the crowds lined the street and hailed Jesus Christ as the Master and the longed for deliverer from the tyranny of Roman occupation. But the one that they had revered and loved and followed had now been made a public spectacle. He's been crucified. And the tomb which he was buried is now empty. And they're on their way back to Emmaus, discussing all the events, trying to reason through everything that had happened. This too is the result of their reluctancy to believe. Listen to many of God's people, the communications, the conversations they have. You want to ask them, do y'all believe anything? Because they're so caught up in human reasoning. These two are looking for answers amongst human reasoning. I believe God's people are guilty of looking for answers in the wrong places. They're trying to figure it all out. They're completely caught up with. Their entire mindset and their lives are being shaped by what they perceived had happened. This is very descriptive of so many today. They are also spiritually blind. We read in verse 15 that as they walked and reasoned among themselves, that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. Well, we read in verse 16, their eyes were holden. So there was the very one who could fill their life with joy and hope and enthusiasm and passion and courage, and they could not see. He's right there. And they could not see who he was. Jesus is there, and they know it not. And again, this is so with so many of God's people today. Their eyes are shut to Christ. And they are viewing the happenings of life blinded to the Lord. Again, listen in on the conversations of folks, God's people. And they are viewing the happenings of life blinded to the Lord. They were also filled with sadness. Jesus asked them in verse 17, what manner of conversations are these that ye have one to another as ye walk and are sad? So as they walked along, they're heavy-hearted. They're unhappy. They're downcast. They're dispirited. They're discouraged. And I believe they were distraught. This could be seen upon their faces. It could be seen in the way they walked. And it could be heard in the tone of their conversation. And all the sadness that marks the walk and talk of God's people today. So looking at these two, we see that they are weary. They're disappointed. They're frustrated. They're confused. They're restless. Filled with hopelessness. And again, there they are looking for answers in human reasoning. Tell me that does not describe God's people today. And as they're talking and reasoning together, they're only feeding the sadness. And they're going further and further in the wrong direction. They're also feeling defeated. As they talked about what had come to pass, they said in verse 21, we trusted. Not we trust, but we trusted. Past tense. That is, we had. Not we have. But we had confidence. We had assurance and conviction that it had been He which should have redeemed Israel. Their hopes have been shattered. Their assurance and confidence is gone. Their faith and confidence have been shaken. Their hope is withered. Their joy and enthusiasm has evaporated. Again, they are frustrated. They're disappointed. They're discouraged. They're filled with pessimism. There is no passion. There is no vision. There is no victory. There is no spiritual ambition. There is no zeal. Instead of tarrying at Jerusalem, they are headed back to the routines and ordinary life of Emmaus. And their thought process is this: there's nothing better for us than to go back to Emmaus. And today, the lives of God's people are marked by frustration, disappointment, and discouragement. And every time there's an election that doesn't go the way of many of God's people, they'll even say it's all over. Really? It's all over. That's what these were saying. It's all over. They're viewing life completely blinded to the Lord. They were fearful. They were confused. They said in verse 22, certain women also of our company made us astonished. That is, we are confounded with fear. What had come to pass was to them very sudden and unexpected, and it brought chaos and fear into their lives. And all the chaos that marks the lives of God's people today. In their minds, Christ was no longer relevant to their present situation. They spoke of Christ in the past tense. They had made professions of faith in Him. Perhaps they had seen some of His miracles. Perhaps they had heard some of His teachings. And all of that would have been very exciting to them and very enlightening and uplifting. But now it's all in the past. It's all in the past. Their experience of Jesus was all in the past. They once saw Christ as the answer to all their problems, to all their difficulties, to all their needs, and to all their circumstances. But they no longer see Him that way. In other words, their spiritual past was greater than their spiritual present. You realize that is a huge problem? If your spiritual past is greater than your spiritual present, you have a problem. That is a very dangerous situation to be in. It should not be so. And it doesn't have to be so. Our spiritual present should be greater than our spiritual past. No matter how great the spiritual past is or was. Our spiritual present ought to be greater. So look carefully at these two on this Emmaus road. We need to look very carefully because they are so descriptive of so many of God's people today. But these two individuals did not continue in this condition, because there was another that walked that same road. And he could make a difference. And by the time you get to verse 29, a manifest change has taken place in their perception in their attitude and in their life. And you see them fervently and with hearts overflowing with desire, saying to Christ, there in verse 29, abide with us. Abide with us. And in verse 34, we see them with great conviction, passion, and zeal, declaring, the Lord is risen indeed. The burden has been lifted. An unspeakable joy fills their soul. By the time you get to the end of the account, these two disciples have a new attitude toward the Lord, toward the Lord's service. They have an entirely different outlook upon life, and I believe they have a renewed purpose in life. Everything is different. So how did all that come about? Well, Jesus interrupted their walk. Jesus interrupted their walk. In verse 13 and 14, these two disciples are seen walking together. Their faith, their confidence, their hope, their joy is all gone. It's all in the past. We see them living in defeat and pessimism, headed back to common life. They are in great need. It was during this time that these two, who thought it best to go back to the common life of Emmaus, and are now headed in that direction, that we read in verse 15, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. Those are difference-making words. Notice it doesn't just say Jesus drew near and went with them. That would have been grammatically correct. But it says Jesus himself. It's being emphasized that Jesus was there. Jesus himself drew near and went with them. This is the beginning of a turning point in their lives. Jesus himself drew near and went with them. Why did he draw near? Well, he's there to minister to them. That's why he's there. The one who can transform their unbelief, their hopelessness, their weakness, their sorrow, their disappointment, their discouragement, their uncertainty and their defeat and their weariness, the one who can transform all of that drew near and went with them. And we see from verse 17 that he interrupted their conversation. He interrupted their conversation, and he said unto them, what manner of communications are these that ye have one to another? So he's come to where they are, and he's done so to bring them to verse 29 and to verse 34. He interrupted their walk. We ought to thank God for his interruptions. Also, Jesus causes them to pour out their hearts to him. He asks them in verse 17 again, what manner of communications are these that you have one to another? What he's saying is, what are y'all talking about? What are you talking about? Their response is recorded in verse 18. And one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answering and said unto them, art thou only a stranger? Have no idea who he is. Are you a stranger in Jerusalem? And hast not known the things which are come to pass there? in these days. And then Jesus asked them in verse 19, what things? In other words, what things are you talking about? What's he doing? He's leading them to tell him. And oh, how blessed it is when the Lord shows up and leads us to tell him. That's what he's doing here. Which they did. Verses 19 through 24. We'll not read that, but we already have. But you can read that, and they tell him what things they're talking about. Oh, for the Lord to interrupt our lives, causing us to tell him. God's people need to quit their complaining and tell him. Tell him. Tell the Lord. Oh, we need a writer congressman. Tell the Lord. I guarantee you it'll get you further than writing your congressman who's not going to read your letter anyway. Tell him. Tell him. Then Jesus, so he gets them to the point where they pour out their hearts to him. And then he addresses the source of their problem. He listens as they tell him all. And then he responds in verse 25, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Now, I don't believe he spoke those words with anger. I believe he spoke those words with compassion and endearment. He wants to teach them to know themselves. To know themselves. He wants them to know what the source of their sorrow and the source of the condition that they are in is. And he wants them to know that the source is not their circumstances. The problem is themselves. He is saying to them, and he said, "Oh, ye fools, and slow of heart to believe." What he's saying is, the reason you do not understand, and the reason that you're walking in your own thinking, in your own reasoning, and the reason for your sadness and for your gloom and your defeat, and the reason for the direction of your life is you. Is you. That's almost always the case. One of the reasons that so many of God's people never get beyond where they are is because they do not recognize or admit the real reason why they are where they are. But thank God for the times that Jesus interrupts our lives to tell us what is wrong with us. Not to tell me what's wrong with someone else. But he interrupts our lives and tells us what's wrong with us. His reason for doing so is to bring us out of our present state to a better state. That's why the Lord does it. Now, somebody else, that may not be their reason for telling you what's wrong with you. But that's the Lord's reason. He tells us what's wrong with us to bring us out of our present state to a better state. Also, Jesus presents to them, so he's presented the problem. The problem is you, he says. And then he presents to them the remedy for their lives. After what he said in verse 25, notice verse 26, he reasons with them, ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? He reasons with them. But then verse 27, and beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded, that is, he explained and he made clear unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. They walked along silently and intently listening, and perhaps stopped along the way several times as Jesus explained, as Jesus made clear the Scriptures concerning Himself. This is the way the Lord does it still today. He interrupts our life. He shows us the problem with ourselves. And then He presents Himself in His Word. That's how He does it. Which causes the heart to come under the influence of the opened Word. The result is seen in verse 32. Did not our heart burn within us while He talked with us by the way, and while He opened to us the Scriptures? As Christ explained and clarified the things concerning Himself from the Scriptures, they begin to feel deep feelings. They begin to have a longing in their soul. They begin to feel passion and ambition and zeal. Which brings us to verse 32 again. Their hearts were ablaze. Their hearts are consumed by the things that Jesus explained and clarified concerning Himself. Their hearts have come under the influence of the opened Word. And there's now an outpouring and an inner stirring of the Spirit of God. But it did not end there. It did not end with seeing Jesus on the pages of this book. Art thou a stranger? They asked. So they have gone from seeing Him as some stranger to now seeing Him on the pages of this book. We need to see Him on the pages of this book. But we need to go much further than that. We need to go further than that. Jesus brings them to the point where they have an overwhelming desire for Him. Yes, we need to see Him on the pages of this book. But the next step is to have a desire for Him. So their hearts are ablaze, consumed by what Jesus had explained and clarified concerning Himself. And then in verse 28, they have reached their destination. And they drew nigh unto the village whither they went, and He, Jesus, made as though He would have gone further. So they've reached their destination. They perhaps turned toward the house, but Jesus continues going on. Verse 29. But they constrained Him. They took hold of Him, saying, abide or dwell with us. It is as if they're saying, oh, please, don't go. Come on in. Tell us again. Show us again. Show us some more. They are brought to the point where they feel and say, we want you. We need you. Please don't go. We can't live without you. Abide with us. Our house is open. All need to be brought to that place. Oh, that's seeing Jesus beyond the pages of this book The saying, abide with us. Dwell with us. And then notice what happened. We read in verse 29, and he went in to tarry with them. He went in to tarry with them. He's gone from verse 18, from being a stranger to now being a guest in their house. What a transformation. But notice verse 30. He didn't just go into their house. It came to pass as he sat at meat with them. There they are, sitting at the same table with Jesus. Jesus is a guest in their house, and they're enjoying Him. Oh, you can see Jesus on the pages of this book without enjoying Him. But now, they've not only seen Jesus on the pages of this book, He's in their house, they're sitting at the same table with Him, they're enjoying Christ. That needs to be us. But then notice what happens. So there they are sitting at the same table. Verse 30, and it came to pass as he sat at meat with them, he took bread and blessed it and brake and gave to them. So there they are sitting at the same table. But something else has happened. They're now receiving from Him. They've gone to thinking that Christ is just some stranger, to seeing Him on the pages of this book, to having Him in their house, sitting at the same table, and now He took bread and brake it and gave it to them. They're receiving from Him. Jesus becomes host. Abide with us. He's the guest. But you abide, if Christ abides with you, I promise you, He's going to become host. And you will receive from Him. And when Jesus becomes host, you see things that you did not see before. Notice, and their eyes were open, verse 31, and they knew Him. They received from Him, and their eyes were opened, and they knew Him. He's now known in a different way. All God's people need to know Christ. It's sad, but many cannot even see Him on the pages of this book. We pray that's not the case, that you can at least see Jesus on the pages of this book. But it must not stop there. And they knew Him. Notice verse 35. And they told what things were done in the way. Okay, the things that transpired on that road to Emmaus, and how He was known of them. That's what transpired in the house. But how was He made known? In breaking of bread. He was made known when He broke the bread and gave it to them. That's when they knew Him. When they received from Him, that's when they knew. Now, I believe that when He passed them the bread, they could see the nail prints, and they knew it's Him. It's Him. But my point is, when you receive from Him personally, you'll know. You'll know. Lastly, the result of all this. Verse 33. And they rose up the same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 gathered together, and them that were with them. So they go back to Jerusalem, which is the place of persecution and opposition. But they're no longer the same. They're no longer the same. Those hearts that were so filled with unbelief, they believe. Those hearts that were so heavy, the burden has been lifted. Those hearts that were so unhappy, joy unspeakable has filled their soul. Those hearts that were so discouraged are now encouraged. Those hearts that were so fearful are now filled with courage. Those hearts that were so pessimistic and hopeless now are filled with, they're now optimistic and filled with blessed assurance and conviction. Those hearts that were so defeated are now victorious. Those hearts that held Jesus as a past memory have now come to see the reality of Jesus Christ. And they returned to Jerusalem. And they did so with a new passion and new zeal, new ambition, new desires, new resolve, new determination. They did so with a new attitude toward the Lord, toward His service. They did so with an entirely different outlook upon life. And they did so with a renewed purpose in life. So they get to where the 11 are assembled in that house and hear them. As they arrive in Jerusalem, verse 34, the Lord is risen indeed. They are declaring a fact regarding Christ. But they're not just declaring a fact regarding Christ, that He's risen. I believe they're saying, Jesus is our life. He's our life. He's our reason for living. You see, Jesus has brought about a spiritual resurrection in their life. And oh, may we personally experience what we read here. We need to see Him on the pages of this book. But that will not impact your life as much as if you can advance past that and He abide with you and you receive from Him. Then you'll know. Then you'll know personally. And oh, that we would experience what they experienced that day. That we would, in these trying times, have our eyes opened and our hearts burning, filled with a desire that we've got to have Him. Don't go. Don't go. Filled with the realization of our need for Him. This is where we need to be brought to every single day. Brother John, if you'd come and lead us